The Krell warlord stopped mid-roar when the human girl pulled a fork from her pocket. Not a blade, not a plasma torch, a bent piece of stainless steel with 4 tines, the kind you'd use to spear broccoli in a station cafeteria. The arena fell silent. 80,000 beings, Krell, Vaxian, Zenthi, even a few stoic architects, leaned forward in their seats, trying to understand what they were seeing. Cadet Lena Kovač stood in the center of the dueling circle, her uniform jacket torn at the shoulder, her left eye swelling shut, and that ridiculous fork gleaming under the plasma lights. The warlord's translator crackled with laughter. Then the crowd joined in, a wave of sound that rattled the reinforced glass of the observation decks. But Lena didn't lower the fork. She just smiled. Small, lopsided, the kind of smile that came right before something broke.
The Galactic Combat Academy sat in low orbit above Titan, a sprawling ring of titanium and glass where the Coalition trained its elite warriors. Humans had only been members for 3 years, and most species still treated them like probationary janitors. Lena Kovač had learned that the hard way. She'd grown up in Split, Croatia, in a family that still made fig jam every August and hung rosemary over doorways for luck. Her grandmother used to say that stubbornness was the Kovač inheritance, more valuable than land, stronger than blood. Lena carried that with her when she enlisted, when she boarded the shuttle to Titan, when she walked into her first sparring session and got thrown across the mat by a Krell twice her size. The Krell were the Coalition's shock troops, 7 feet tall, triple-hearted, with exoskeletons that could shrug off plasma bolts. They didn't respect Earth. They didn't respect soft-skinned bipeds who'd only just figured out faster-than-light travel. And they especially didn't respect Lena, who'd made the mistake of beating a Krell lieutenant in hand-to-hand during her second week. That lieutenant's name was Throk. He'd challenged her to a rematch in the open arena, where disputes were settled under Coalition law. She'd accepted because refusing would have branded her a coward. Now, standing in the prep chamber with her hands shaking and her stomach hollow, she wondered if cowardice might have been the smarter play. Her assigned weapon rack was empty. Looking for something? The voice belonged to Ensign Jarek, a Vaxian with scales like oil slicks and a grin full of needle teeth. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Heard there was a clerical error. Your gear got reassigned. Lena's jaw tightened. Reassigned where? Does it matter? Jarek shrugged. Throk's waiting. You forfeit in 2 minutes or you walk out there with what you've got. She had a torn jacket, standard-issue boots, and the contents of her pockets, a hair tie, a half-empty pack of gum, and the fork she'd swiped from breakfast because the cafeteria dishwashers kept losing utensils. She pulled it out and turned it over in her hand. The metal was thin, lightweight, probably some aluminum alloy. The tines were slightly bent from when she'd used it to pry open a jammed locker last week. Jarek saw it and laughed so hard he had to brace himself against the wall. Oh, this is perfect. The human brought a fork. Lena didn't answer. She walked past him, through the tunnel that led to the arena floor, and into the light. The roar hit her like a physical force. 80,000 voices, most of them jeering, some chanting Throk's name in a rhythm that sounded like war drums. The arena was an open circle 50 meters across, ringed by tiered seating that climbed toward the domed ceiling. Holographic banners floated above the crowd, displaying the fighters' stats. Throk's glowed in crimson, undefeated in 43 duels, 300 kills in live combat, decorated twice by the Coalition High Command. Lena's stats were barely visible, a thin line of text at the bottom of the display. Cadet, Earth Division, no combat decorations, no duels on record. Throk stood in the center of the circle, his exoskeleton polished to a mirror shine. He held a plasma glaive, its blade crackling with purple energy. When he saw Lena, he didn't laugh. He just tilted his head, the way a predator might study prey that had wandered too close. The Arbiter, a floating sphere of silver alloy, descended from the ceiling and spoke in a toneless voice that translated simultaneously into every language. Combatants, declare your readiness. Ready, Throk said, his voice like grinding stone. Lena raised the fork. Ready. The crowd exploded. Laughter, disbelief, a few scattered boos from beings who thought this was an insult to the tradition of the duel. Throk's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. He leveled a glaive at her, the blade humming. You mock me, Lena replied. Her voice didn't shake. I'm just working with what I've got. The Arbiter's light pulsed. Begin. Throk lunged. He moved faster than anything that size had a right to, closing the distance in 3 strides. The glaive came down in an overhead arc meant to split her in half. Lena twisted left, felt the heat of the blade sear past her shoulder, and drove the fork toward the bap in his exoskeleton at the elbow joint. The tines punched through chitin and into soft tissue. Throk roared, not in pain but in surprise. He swung the glaive sideways, a reflexive sweep that would have taken her head off if she hadn't already dropped and rolled. She came up 5 meters away, the fork still in her hand, now slick with something that looked like motor oil but smelled faintly of copper. The crowd went quiet. Throk looked down at his arm. Green ichor dripped from the puncture wound. He flexed his fingers, testing the damage, then looked back at Lena. His mandibles spread wide, and for the first time she saw something other than contempt in his eyes. He saw a fight.
Throk didn't charge again. He circled, the glaive held low, his 3 hearts pounding a rhythm Lena could almost feel through the arena floor. She mirrored his movement, keeping the fork angled toward him, her weight on the balls of her feet. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. Stubbornness isn't about winning, it's about not falling down until the other guy does. The arbiter hovered above them, silent. This was their moment, and the rules were simple. Fight until one of them yielded, fell unconscious, or died. Coalition law didn't care which. Lena's mind raced. The fork had worked once because Throk hadn't expected it, but he wouldn't make that mistake again. She needed leverage, needed to get inside his guard where the glaive couldn't swing freely. But he outweighed her by at least 100 kilos, and his reach was twice hers. If she tried to grapple, he'd crush her. So she didn't try to grapple. She feinted left, then dove right, rolling under a sweep of the glaive and coming up behind him. Before he could turn, she jammed the fork into the back of his knee, between the plates of his exoskeleton. This time, Throk screamed. It was a sound that made the Krell in the audience surge to their feet, a bellow of rage and pain that shook the air. He spun, faster than she'd anticipated, and his backhand caught her across the ribs. The impact lifted her off the ground and sent her skidding across the arena floor. She tasted blood, felt something crack in her chest, but she held onto the fork. She had to. It was the only thing keeping her alive. Throk limped toward her, the glaive dragging sparks from the floor. His leg buckled with every step, but he didn't stop. Lena pushed herself upright, her vision swimming. The crowd was chanting again, but she couldn't make out the words. Everything sounded muffled, like she was underwater. She thought of her grandmother, standing in the kitchen and split, hands dusted with flour. "You want to know the secret to winning?" the old woman had said once, kneading dough with the same rhythm she'd used for 60 years. "You make them think you're done. Then you get up one more time than they do." Lena got up. Throk swung the glaive in a wide arc, trying to end it. She didn't dodge. She stepped into the swing, letting the flat of the blade glance off her shoulder instead of the edge catching her neck. Pain exploded down her arm, but she was inside his guard now, close enough to smell the ozone from the glaive's power cell. She drove the fork into his chest. Not deep, his exoskeleton was thicker there, but enough to scrape against bone. Throk's eyes went wide. He dropped the glaive and grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground. His grip was iron, squeezing, and Lena's vision started to dim at the edges. But she didn't let go of the fork. With her free hand, she twisted it, leveraging the tines against the crack she'd made in his armor. Something gave, a wet, tearing sound, and Throk's grip loosened. Not much, but enough for Lena to suck in half a breath. She twisted the fork again, harder this time, and felt it punch through into something soft. Throk's secondary heart. He dropped her. Lena hit the ground hard, her lungs burning, and scrambled backward. Throk staggered, one hand pressed to his chest, green ichor pouring between his fingers. He looked at her, then at the fork still embedded in his armor, and his mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter or disbelief. "Human, you fight like Krell." Then he collapsed. The arena went silent. The arbiter descended, scanning Throk's vitals. "Combatant Throk is incapacitated. Victory to Cadet Kovač." The Krell in the audience erupted, not in anger, but in something that sounded almost like respect. They pounded their fists against the seats, a rhythmic thunder that drowned out everything else. Lena stood there, swaying, the fork still in her hand, and tried to process what had just happened. She'd won, with a cafeteria fork, against an undefeated warlord. The medics rushed onto the floor, a team of vaccines and one stoic architect who moved with clinical efficiency. They loaded Throk onto a hover stretcher, their instruments already scanning for the damage to his heart. Lena watched them work, her own injuries forgotten for a moment, until one of the medics, a vaccine with kind eyes, turned to her. "You need treatment," he said. "I need to sit down," and Lena replied, and her legs gave out. They took her to the med bay, a sterile white room that smelled like antiseptic and ozone. The architect medic, tall, silent, with fingers that moved like surgical instruments, set her ribs and sealed the cut above her eye with a dermal regenerator. Lena sat on the exam table, staring at the fork she'd refused to let go of, and tried to make sense of the last hour. The door hissed open. Captain Roden entered, a Zenthi with 4 arms and a face like carved granite. He was the Academy's combat instructor, the one who'd overseen Lena's training since she arrived. He looked at her, then at the fork, and his translator emitted something that sounded like a sigh. "Cadet Kovač," he said, "do you have any idea what you've done?" Lena's throat was still raw from Throk's grip. "Won a duel? You humiliated a Krell warlord in front of 80,000 witnesses." Roden crossed 2 of his arms. "Throk's clan is demanding an investigation. They claim you used an illegal weapon." Lena held up the fork. "This? Coalition law specifies that all dueling weapons must be registered and approved by the arbiter. You brought an unregistered implement into the arena." "I didn't bring it," Lena said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "My assigned weapons were stolen. This was all I had." Roden studied her for a long moment. "Can you prove that?" "Check the security logs. My prep chamber was tampered with." She met his eyes. "And ask Ensign Yarrick why he thought it was funny." The captain's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air. He tapped a command into his wrist console, and a holographic screen appeared, displaying footage from the prep chamber. Lena watched herself discover the empty weapon rack, watched Yarrick's mocking smile, and felt a cold knot of anger settle in her chest. Roden dismissed the screen. "This will be forwarded to the disciplinary board. In the meantime, you're confined to quarters pending the investigation." "What about Throk?" "He'll recover. The medics replaced his secondary heart with a synthetic. He'll be back on duty in a week." Roden turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Cadet, that was the most resourceful thing I've seen in 20 years of teaching." He left before Lena could respond. She spent the next 3 days in her quarters, a narrow room with a bunk, a desk, and a window that looked out over Titan's methane lakes. The Academy's rumor network worked faster than any official communication. By the second day, everyone knew about the fork, about Throk, about the human who'd carved up a Krell warlord with a piece of cutlery. Some cadets treated her like a hero, others avoided her like she carried a plague. The Krell were split. Half of them wanted her expelled, the other half wanted to recruit her. On the 3rd day, Throk himself showed up. Lena was reading a tactical manual when the door chimed. She opened it to find the warlord standing in the corridor, his chest armor replaced with a lighter version that showed the edge of a bandage. He looked at her, and she looked back, and for a moment, neither of them spoke.
"You should be resting," Lena said finally. "So should you." Throk's mandibles clicked. "May I enter?" She stepped aside. He had to duck to fit through the doorway, and the room suddenly felt very small. He stood near the desk, his gaze moving over the sparse furnishings, the tactical manual, the fork Lena had cleaned and set on a windowsill like a trophy. "You kept it," he said. Seemed wrong to throw it away. Throk picked up the fork, turning it over in his massive hand. "I have fought warriors across 40 systems. I have killed beings twice my size and half my weight. I have never been defeated by a human." He set the fork down carefully. "I underestimated you. Most people do. That will change." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that might have been respect. "The Krell respect strength. You have proven yours. If the disciplinary board rules in your favor, my clan will withdraw their complaint." Lena blinked. "Why?" "Because you fought with honor. You used what you had. That is the Krell way." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Also, my secondary heart was weak. You did me a favor by destroying it. The synthetic is stronger." He left before she could ask if he was joking. The disciplinary board convened the next morning. Lena stood in the center of a circular chamber, facing a panel of 5 officers, one from each major coalition species. Captain Roden presented the evidence, the security footage, Jarrett's confession, extracted after 40 minutes of questioning, and a full analysis of the duel itself. The Krell representative, a grizzled veteran named Karax, leaned forward. "Cadet Kovač, do you deny that you brought an unregistered weapon into the arena?" "No, sir," Lena said, "but I didn't have a choice. My assigned weapons were sabotaged. And yet you chose to fight rather than forfeit. Forfeiting would have been interpreted as cowardice. I was representing Earth." Karax's mandibles spread in what might have been a smile. "You represented it well. The board deliberated for 12 minutes. When they returned, the human representative, a wiry woman named Commander Osei, delivered the verdict. Cadet Kovač, the board finds that you acted within the bounds of coalition law. The sabotage of your equipment constitutes a violation, and Ensign Jarek has been formally reprimanded and reassigned. As for the duel itself, Osei glanced at the other officers. The arbiter's ruling stands. You are cleared of all charges. Lena exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. However, Osei continued, we are issuing a new regulation. All cadets are now required to carry a registered backup weapon at all times. This incident has highlighted a gap in our protocols. Lena nodded. Understood, ma'am. Dismissed. She walked out of the chamber into a corridor packed with cadets. Word had spread, and it seemed like half the academy had gathered to see the outcome. When they saw her, a few started clapping, then more joined in, and within seconds the hallway was filled with applause. Krell pounding their fists, Vaxians hissing approval, even a cluster of architects inclining their heads in acknowledgement. Lena felt her face flush. She kept walking, but she couldn't stop the smile.
The academy cafeteria was a chaotic mix of species, languages, and meal preferences. Lena sat at a corner table with a tray of something vaguely resembling scrambled eggs and a mug of coffee strong enough to strip paint. Across from her sat Ensign Mira Chen, a fellow human cadet who had arrived 2 months after Lena and immediately declared herself Lena's unofficial publicist. "You're famous," Mira said, scrolling through her datapad. "There are 3 articles about you on the Coalition newsfeed. One of them calls you the Fork Warrior." Lena groaned. "Please tell me that's not sticking." "Oh, it's sticking. There's already a betting pool on your next duel," Mira grinned. "I put 50 credits on you winning with a spoon." "I'm not dueling anyone else." "Tell that to the Krell. Apparently half of Throk's battalion wants to challenge you now. They think you're some kind of, I don't know, warrior prophet." Lena stabbed at her eggs with her fork. A new one, standard issue, disappointingly normal. "I just want to graduate and get assigned to a ship." "Too late for that. You're a symbol now," Mira leaned back. "Besides, you earned it. You took down an undefeated warlord with a piece of cutlery. That's the kind of story people tell for generations." Lena thought about her grandmother, about the kitchen and split, about the stubbornness that had carried her this far. Maybe Mira was right. Maybe this was the kind of story that mattered. Not because it was grand or heroic, but because it was real, because it proved that humans could adapt, could survive, could win even when the odds were impossible. A shadow fell over the table. Lena looked up to find Throk standing there, his posture formal, his expression unreadable. "Cadet Kovač, I request permission to join you." Mira's eyes went wide. Lena gestured to the empty seat. "Go ahead." Throk sat, his bulk making the chair creak. He set a tray on the table, a slab of raw meat that glistened under the cafeteria lights. "I wanted to speak with you privately, but I see you have company." "Mira's fine. What's on your mind?" "The Krell respect strength, but we also value mentorship. I have been authorized by my clan to offer you a position as an auxiliary of my battalion." He paused. "It is rare for a non-Krell to receive such an offer." Lena blinked. "You want me to join your battalion?" "Not permanently. As an auxiliary, you would train with us, learn our combat techniques, and participate in joint operations. It would be educational." Mira kicked Lena under the table. Lena ignored her. "Why?" "Because you fought like a Krell." Throk's mandibles clicked. "And because my secondary heart was weak. I owe you a debt." Lena considered. Training with the Krell would be brutal, but it would also make her a better fighter, and if she was going to survive in the Coalition military, she needed every advantage she could get. "I'll think about it," she said. Throk nodded. "That is all I ask." He stood, picked up his tray, and walked away. Mira stared after him, then turned to Lena. "You're gonna say yes, aren't you?" "Probably." "You're insane." "Yeah, but I'm still here." The weeks that followed were a blur of training, classes, and the occasional interview request from Coalition media outlets. Lena turned down most of them, but she did agree to one, a short segment for the Academy's internal broadcast, where she talked about Earth, about her family, about the importance of using what you had instead of waiting for what you wanted. The fork sat on her desk, a reminder of that day in the arena. She didn't carry it anymore. Regulations required her to have a proper backup weapon now, but she kept it close. It was a symbol, like Mira had said, not of violence, but of resilience. 3 months after the duel, Lena graduated from the academy. She was assigned to the coalition ship Vanguard, a cruiser that patrolled the Outer Rim. On her last day at Titan, she walked through the empty arena, stood in the center of the dueling circle, and remembered the roar of the crowd, the weight of the fork in her hand, the moment when everything had hung in balance. She'd survived, she'd won, and she'd proven that humans belonged in the coalition, not because they were the strongest or the fastest, but because they were stubborn enough to keep fighting, even when the odds were impossible. As she left the arena, she passed a group of Krell cadets. One of them, a young warrior with fresh scars on his exoskeleton, stopped and inclined his head. "Fork warrior," his translator crackled with respect. Lena smiled. "Just Lena. Not to us." She didn't argue. She just kept walking, out into the corridor, towards the shuttle bay, towards the ship that would carry her to the stars.
6 years later, Lena Kovač stood on the bridge of the Vanguard, watching a distant star system flicker on the tactical display. She was a lieutenant now, decorated twice for valor, respected by her crew. The fork sat in a case in her quarters, alongside other mementos, a piece of shrapnel from her first combat mission, a commendation medal, a letter from her grandmother written on actual paper. The Krell battalion had become something close to family. She trained with them twice a year, learned their war songs, shared their meals. Throk had retired from active duty, but he still sent her messages, tactical advice, updates on his clan, the occasional joke that didn't quite translate. The humans were no longer probationary members of the coalition. They'd proven themselves in a dozen conflicts, had earned their place among the stars. And every time a new human cadet arrived at the academy, they heard the story of Lena Kovač, who'd won a duel with a cafeteria fork and changed the way the galaxy saw Earth. Lena didn't think of herself as a symbol. She was just a woman from Split who'd learned to be stubborn, who'd fought when she had to, who'd gotten up one more time than her enemies. That was enough. The comm crackled. "Lieutenant, we're receiving a distress signal from the mining colony on Kepler 442b. Hostile forces, unknown origin." Lena straightened. "Set course. Full speed." The bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency. Lena's hand drifted to the knife on her belt. Standard issue, coalition approved, nothing like the fork she'd once carried, but the principle was the same. You fought with what you had, you got up one more time, and you never ever let them see you quit. The Vanguard jumped to faster than light, and Lena Kovač smiled.